anyway, it's one of those things you never think of, but there are places in the ocean where it's warm water. And so don't put one of those in the Dead Sea, for example, or, some lake that's, boiling, Yellowstone or somewhere like that. Okay, well, the good news is you get me out of the way first thing today, and then you don't have to hear from me again until Wednesday. So that's basically like a 5-day weekend. So not a bad deal. So before we start the lecture, when you do hear from me Wednesday, it will be the hydrolyte lab for the first half of you. So somewhere on the Google Drive, there's a folder called Hydrolyte Lab, and in there's a couple of files that are the student version of Hydrolyte for PCs and for Apple computers. So sometime the next few days, if you have a PC, copy over this file that says install student he60 win32 move that onto your computer, stick it wherever you want to have Hydrolyte, and when you click on that guy, it should install the code. At least it worked okay on mine. Then if you have an Apple, there's one that says install student osx.zip, and then there's a OSX beta notes on instructions on how to do the installation on Apples. And so copy this file to your Apple, and there's the instructions, bring that over. And we tested that on Riley's PC, it worked okay, it runs okay, etc. So it'll just speed things up if you install this beforehand. And what will happen is it will either work just fine, or you'll get some message that says you're not allowed to install software on this computer, see your IT administrator or whatever. And that usually happens when somebody's got a university computer and they've got it blocked where you can't put software on it. Or, if you're a US Navy person, my God, it's almost impossible to install software on a military computer these days because they're so concerned about, viruses and so forth. Or you'll click on this thing and you'll get some message that'll say file not found. Well, the file's there. What it's really telling you is you don't have permission to go over and get that file and put it on the software. Anyway, give it a try, and more than likely it will all work. I just did this in Korea. Everything worked fine, but you never know. And so we'll have a couple of days to get things fixed if something weird happens. So anyway, and then later on we'll play with the rest of the stuff that's in there. If you want to copy that stuff over as well, you can, or we'll just do it during class. Okay. Yeah. There's no difference. They will look exactly the same. It's just that one has been compiled for Windows and one has been compiled for the Apple operating system.
It's a student license, so I assume there's a full license.
Yeah, we'll go over that. Basically, this is the next version 6.0, but with some of the advanced features that we're not going to need in here blocked out, and it doesn't have the source code and all those kinds of things. But it's basically a beta test version of 6.0.
Does it run out in August?
It quits at the end of June, but you have the license, so you'll get, you can get the real version from Headley. So.
And that's another difference. For the students, by the end of the class, you don't have access to
it. Yeah, what it does, if you try to run it in July, it will erase your hard drive and send a message to the CIA that you're, a spy from Iran or somewhere. I don't know what it'll do. Anyway, and then you'll never be able to get on another airplane. Okay, so enough said there. Okay. Let's see here, slideshow. So today we get into the first of, second lecture on remote sensing, but there's a number of kind of broad categories of how you can invert remote sensing spectra and get out information about the ocean. And the first one of them today is statistical methods, and then Colin will talk about semi-analytic methods. So the game we're going to play now is the satellite has taken its imagery. NASA has done their whole atmospheric correction thing, and they've given you a remote sensing reflectance spectrum at the sea surface, and now you need to take that and extract chlorophylls or IOPs or KD 490 or water depth or whatever it is. So we're going to look at one way you can do that to start here. Whoops, let's see, that's on. This guy is not, when else fails, put the little dealie in so it can talk to the computer. Okay, so we kind of recall this remote sensing inverse business where you've got, in this case, RRS, and you may have some constraints, you may have imperfect atmospheric correction, but you're going to feed those into some sort of relatively simple mathematical model and extract whatever it is that you're interested in. Okay, so this statistical family is basically all it is correlations. So you start out with some data of RRS, for example, and measured chlorophylls, and plot chlorophyll versus RRS and fit a curve through it, and that's all it amounts to. It's just the curve fitting may get pretty fancy. So when you do that fitting, of course, there's, like, let's say it was a trivial case, you were going to fit chlorophyll to AX plus B, and X is chlorophyll. Well, then you force that data, you get the best fit, and that determines your A and B. Then you've got a function where you can plug in RRS and get back chlorophyll. So nothing profound there. We're going to have some kind of model. We're going to force the model to fit data that contains both the inputs and outputs. And so that's where the statistical part, or these are often called empirical models, that's where the name comes from. And then after we've determined whatever unknown parameters there are, we then take the formula and apply it to a new RRS and get out a chlorophyll where we don't know what the answer was. Okay, so the whole business all started out with very, very simple statistical models. So we've all seen these kind of pictures of a map of chlorophyll for the whole world, and we'll talk about band ratio algorithms, which are what started off this game, and then we'll talk about neural networks, which is sort of the latest thing people do, but both of them have a lot of similarities. So if you go back to where this all started, here is a plot of the water leaving radiance, LW, versus wavelength for 4 different chlorophylls. So here's chlorophyll of 0.027 milligrams per cubic meter, 0.2, 0.6, and then 8.9. And so people way back when, this was from a 1985 paper, they did things like fly over the ocean in an airplane, they measured LW, they had ships in the water, they measured chlorophyll, and they said, gee, look, you know, low chlorophyll, it's blue water, high chlorophyll, it's green water. There's a lot of variability in the blue, but there's a region here in the green where these curves all just happen to cross. So the idea was if we took the ratio of the blue band to, let's say, one of these green bands, this doesn't change much, this does, that ratio will tell us what the chlorophyll is. And so great idea. And then here's actually what started off the CZCS algorithm. They had 33 data points, and they took, if you look here, the bands, this is from CZCS bands 443, 520, 550, and 670. So those are bands 1, 2, 3, and 4. So they looked in this plot at the ratio of band 1 to band 3, which is LW 443 over 550, versus chlorophyll, plotted on a log-log plot, and they had a whole 33 data points to develop the first CZCS algorithm. And so you look at this and say, well, I can plot log is A plus, constant 1 plus constant 2 times the log of the ratio, get the best linear fit here. There's our model for retrieving chlorophyll. Now, another war story, back when CZCS was being proposed, there was, of course, you know, all kinds of studies done. The National Academy of Science had a big study of whether this, you know, should NASA spend their money on this. And there, Howard Gordon says, a world famous biologist, who I don't know his name, was on this panel for NSF and looked at this and said, I do not know of a single competent biologist who considers remote sensing of the oceans to be an important problem. Well, fortunately, NASA didn't pay attention to this guy. They built CZCS, and you know, here we are today. But that was the view. I mean, all biology happened on land. Who cares what's going on in the ocean? So anyway, there it got started out. The CZCS instrument flew from 78 to 86. It was only designed to last for a year or something, proof of principle, but it got 66,000 images like this, and it totally revolutionized oceanography. Nobody had any idea that oceans had variability on this kind of scale where you could go, you know, from high to low chlorophyll in 100 meters. I mean, it just blew everybody away. And you know, here you can even see, here's Cape Hatteras, Cape Cod, we're up here, Gulf of Maine, you know, the Gulf Stream's coming along here. It sort of leaves the continental shelf here and wanders off into the ocean. And here you can see there's a warm core ring has spun off here. You can almost just see it going around in the chlorophyll map. And it was just mind-blowing to people at the time. So here chlorophyll is from 0.2 in the blue to 30 in the red. So of course along the coastal areas is generally where you have the high chlorophyll, but not necessarily. Okay, so enough said. So here's an example of a bunch of more recent band ratio algorithms. And all that's happened is people have gotten more and more data sets and they fit fancier curves through it. So for example, here's the CWIF's OC4 version 4 algorithm for chlorophyll. Well, what they've done, here's chlorophyll here versus ratios. And so they take the ratio of 443 to 555, 490 to 555, and 510 to 555. And they look at which ratio is the maximum. They take the log of that, and that's x, and then they plug x into this fourth order polynomial. And that's this black line that goes through the data here. So as you get more data, you know, this is not a nice linear function like those first 33 points. And by looking at one ratio or another, you can have kind of a curve that fits this area and maybe this area and then that area, and the algorithm will just switch over from sort of one slope to the next. And anyway, so that's just an algorithm there. Here's the MODIS algorithm for KD at 490. I said that's a standard NASA product. So they look at 488 to 551 and then plug that ratio into a little formula, gives you KD at 490. We saw models where if you have KD at 490, you can get it at other wavelengths, and away you go. Here's MODIS algorithms for CDOM at 400, CDOM absorption at 400, absorption by phytoplankton at 675. They've got several ratios here of one band to the another. Then the CDOM algorithm says, you know, you take this little function of the band 1 to 5 and that's squared, and then the band 2 to 5 and that's squared, and then there's the phytoplankton absorption at 675, another little function. And you can find dozens more of these things in the literature, and every once in a while somebody cooks up a better algorithm for chlorophyll or whatever it is, and then NASA goes back and reprocesses all of the imagery all the way back to CZCS. And then you have a new set of outputs that you can play with or compare with the old ones. So Jeremy Wardell will probably talk about, you know, we've done reprocessing number 5.2.3a or something. Well, that's what's going on, is better and better algorithms, or maybe an algorithm for something new. So people do that all the time. A fun but somewhat scary project would be this. Here's a paper by Stramsky and Dericki comparing different algorithms. So here they've got a big appendix. There's a CZCS chlorophyll algorithm, the MODIS chlorophyll, for case 2. Let's see, maybe there's another one there. The CWIFS chlorophyll algorithm, and then there's algorithms for KD and so on. So what you can do after next Wednesday is run hydrolyte, put in a chlorophyll, pick some biooptical model in hydrolyte that turns chlorophyll into IOPs, and compute the remote sensing reflectance spectrum. Then take that spectrum and plug it in to these different algorithms for chlorophyll. In principle, they should all give you back the same chlorophyll, which is what went into hydrolyte. It will be scary how different those chlorophyll values are. So if you don't have anything better to do, like, next Friday night, dig out this paper. It should be in the library. Program a couple of those up, feed in some hydrolyte spectra, and you'll be lucky if they agree within a factor of 2. Okay. One of the nice things about band ratio algorithms is this. Here's an example of remote sensing reflectance spectra with atmospheric correction done by 2 different algorithms, which we don't have to worry about. That's called empirical line fit, and Tofka's a radiative transfer code. Anyway, the purple curve here is what one atmospheric correction algorithm says is the remote sensing reflectance. The white curve is what the other one says. They're simply different atmospheric corrections. Now, the nice thing about band ratios, and this is one of the reasons they were used for CZCS, is they knew they couldn't do a very good job of atmospheric correction. But if I take, say, this wavelength, let's say it's the 440 or something, and I divide it into the 550 wavelength, well, the ratio of this point to this one on the purple curve won't be much different than the ratio of this point to this one on the white curve. So the band ratio algorithms are less sensitive to bad atmospheric correction. If I had some algorithm where I was actually using the magnitude of the spectrum, those are much different spectra. They differ by, like a factor of 3 or 4 down here and maybe 50% up here. So those are much different if you look at the magnitude. But when you take a ratio, you're really just looking at the shape of the curve and you're throwing out that magnitude information. Did you have a question? Yeah.
So I guess also the last lecture you had. So for atmospheric corrections, is most of the variability always magnitude and less spectral shape?
Well, you can get, there is a little bit of difference in the shape, but the main difference is in the magnitude in this particular example. But yeah, the atmospheric correction can affect both the magnitude and the shape of what you end up with. Okay, here's a bunch of different spectra. I don't know, like 50 or however many it is. So these are all different spectra from very big and very low. And if you look at the ratio of 490 to 555, every one of these spectra has the same ratio. It's 1.71 plus or minus 0.01. If you plug that into a chlorophyll algorithm for the CZCS one, it says the chlorophyll is 0.59. In actuality, this water body had chlorophyll of less than 0.2, but I cheated a little bit here. This is actually shallow water, so these different spectra are showing different bottom depths and bottom types, even though the water column's the same. So you can't really apply a deep water algorithm to these. But the point I'm making is the band ratios are the same, even though the spectra are totally different. So we'll see why something like a band ratio algorithm often fails if you're in shallow water, for example, and you've got more going on, namely bottom reflectance, than you had in the, an algorithm like this where it assumes the water's infinitely deep. So anyway, just another example of different spectra giving the same band ratio algorithm and the environmental conditions being much different. That's the whole non-uniqueness business I talked about the other day. So here's an example of non-uniqueness. So Heidi Dearson, top quality oceanographer, there was a field experiment where we were looking at bottom stuff, and this was back around the year 2000. And so what she did was she had however many here, something like 3,600 measurements, where they used an acoustic pinger to get the bottom depth. And this is water that's like 5, 10, 15 meters deep, very clear. But anyway, they had the bottom depth, and they also had hyperspectral measurements of the water leaving radiance and remote sensing reflectance at those points. So you plot it up. There's a nice relationship between 555 to 670 and the bottom depth. And then you fit a nice little curve through it that you see here. Now, here, this is clear water, so 555 is very clear. You're seeing the bottom, so you're getting bottom reflectance effects. 670, you're out there where the water absorption's high, so that doesn't really vary much because you don't see the bottom at 670 if you're in 5 or 10 or 15 meters of water. You do see it at 555. So that's why she picked those ratios there. So if you came along, this ratio was, say there's 10, 20, 25, you would come up and you would conclude the water was like 4.7 meters deep. And it works great for what she did. Okay, Curt comes along, reads her paper, says, oh, nice little formula here. I'll take that and I'll apply that to some of my imagery, also taken in the Bahamas. Here's what happens. So here's an image. This is a sandbar here, and this is dense seagrass where it's dark, and the red is actually islands. This is just a kind of false color image. So I took Heidi's algorithm, apply it to every pixel in this image, and over the sandbar, it does okay. So you can see here, it says this is like 0 to 2 meters, and then the green is like 4 to 6 meters, and so on down. Well, I actually know that right in the center there, 2 meters is about correct because I went snorkeling there and I could just barely get my head above water at low tide. So I know it's a good retrieval. I validated it. Okay, the problem is, so it does okay here, and here it's completely wrong. It says the depth out here is 0 to 2 meters. The acoustic bathymetry, we went back and forth here, that's down to 6 to 8, 8 to 10. I think there was a little hole there somewhere that was 11 meters deep. So the algorithm worked fine in here and totally failed here. So what went wrong? Well, I did some hydrolyte runs. We had measurements of IOPs, we had measurements of sand reflectance, grass reflectance, etc. So I took a couple of sets of IOPs to sort of bracket what I thought it would have been, and ran hydrolyte with the bottom at different depths and in either a sand bottom or a grass bottom. Okay, so the red curve here is one set of IOPs, sand bottom, and the blue curve's the other set of IOPs in the sand bottom. So if we had that ratio of 25, we would come up, we would hit the red or blue curve, and we'd come across and say, oh, the water's 4 meters deep. Fine. Now, the orange and purple curves are the seagrass bottom. Well, let's just take this curve here. The orange one comes up, but then it doubles over. And so for the ratio of 25, the algorithm says, oh, there's the orange curve, it's 4 meters deep. The real, or another answer would be that it was 9 meters deep. So what was happening here is the algorithm was hitting that shallow point, if you wish, instead of the deep point, so non-uniqueness. And so then the black line is Heidi's curve, where this would come up and say, oh, right here, this is like 4.8 or 5 meters deep. So not much different from when the sand curve was there, but it just didn't work for the deep water. So I plotted up what do these RS spectra look like for the deep and shallow water. Okay, the red curve is for the I think this is for the, this must be for the grass bottom, yeah. So the green curve is the reflectance of the seagrass. So notice it's very high at 550. That's why it's green seagrass. Now, when I run this bottom at 4 meters deep, here's this remote sensing reflectance spectrum. And it's got a big bump in the green because you're seeing the green bottom. When I run it at 9 meters, is a little bit of a bump there, but basically the water absorption and the depth is kind of knocking out the fact that you're seeing the bottom. Now, each one of these spectra, the red and the blue, have the same ratio of 555 to 670. And so, which is, which was this number 25. So these guys, although you look at the spectra and you say, oh yeah, there's obviously something different going on, the band ratio doesn't see any difference in those two spectra. And that's why it was retrieving, you know, a bad depth of 4 meters when it should have been retrieving 9 meters. So you always have this kind of stuff. And of course, the real problem here is she only went down, let's see, she went down, her data went down to like 6 meters. And I shouldn't be trying to apply a model that had a data set that went to 6 meters and apply it in water that is 10 or 12 meters deep. Colin?
But really also, you shouldn't be applying a model that was developed over sand
Right.
to a bottom that has seagrass.
Right, yeah. But I just had to see what happened, and now I know. And I ended up with a great example for a class. Okay, so as we're always beating on you here, when you get a model, you got to understand what went into it. Lydia?
Could it also be that from remote sensing, we just look at the surface? We don't actually go to the bottom.
Yeah.
So if you have grass, then you will only be seeing like the top of the grass.
Right, yeah. So this is all based on above water measurements of either measured from a boat or deduced from an aircraft or satellite, yeah. Okay, so there you've seen one kind of band ratio algorithm. And if you have some data here, in this case, chlorophyll and a ratio here, you can look at this data, this swarm of data, and kind of say, oh yeah, linear fit, or maybe I need some fancier fit, and come up with some little equation and you know, fit a curve through it, and there's your band ratio algorithm, and away you go. The catch is, what if you have such a complicated data set? Here we're looking at the band ratio, one ratio of 2 wavelengths. Well, you've got this sensor. Nowadays it might even be hyperspectral, but at least with, say, MODIS or VIIRS, you maybe have 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 wavelengths in the visible, and maybe there's more than one thing you want to get out. You want to get chlorophyll, CDOM absorption at 400, KD at 490, etc. So you've got a big bunch of inputs, you've got maybe many outputs, and you have no idea, like, what's the mathematical kind of model that I could stick in all those inputs and get out all of those outputs. So if you have a case like that, where you really don't know what the mathematical form of the model is, then one of the things you can use is neural networks. So here's the idea there. There, as it says here, a form of multiprocessor computation based on the parallel architecture of animal brains. Well, whatever that means. So what it amounts to is you have really simple processing elements. That is, you make really simple little decisions like yes or no, or a number between 0 and 1, something like that. You have very simple input and output, which are just real numbers. Those could be remote sensing reflectances at different wavelengths, whatever it happens to be. And there's a lot of interaction between these elements here, and we'll see how that works. So neural networks are useful where you don't know the mathematical form of the model that links the inputs and the outputs, and you have to have a lot of examples of whatever behavior you require in order to train the neural network. So we'll see how that works. And you're going to not really worry yourself about the mathematical structure of the model. Neural network's gonna figure that out for you. And it will determine that from the data. So here's the idea. This is a cartoon of an actual neuron in your brain. So there's a cell body here that's the processing unit, and it gets inputs from neighboring cells. And those inputs are simply that the neighboring cells sent an electrical signal or they didn't. So the neighboring cells fired or they didn't. So here there's two other cells are sending in an electrical impulse and there's two that are not. Then this cell has to make a decision. I've received input from two cells. Do I want to also fire and send an output downstream to my neighbors? And if it does, then it says, okay, fire, and it'll send output along the way to the nearest neighbors. And if it decides that these are not important enough to fire, then it doesn't do anything. So that's the whole idea of a neural network, and we're just going to simulate this now on a computer. So here's kind of looking at this, two inputs, a decision, and an output. So here's an example of how that's set up with sort of the simplest example you could do. We have what's called an input layer, which is simply the values of all the inputs you have, whatever they are. Then we have what's a hidden layer, that's the neuron. And then there's each input has some weight, which basically tells this guy how important that input is. So what the processing does is it says, take the input from here, multiply times its weight, take the input from here, multiply by its weight, add those two together. There may be a bias where you can have an offset of some sort, and then there's a threshold. And it says, if the weight of the inputs and the bias is less than the threshold, don't do anything. If this sum here is greater than the threshold, then output, let's say, a 1. And that just means that the cell has decided to fire and tell his neighbors what's going on. Or in this case, the output for two inputs would either be a 0 or a 1. And so it's doing two things. It's summing the weighted inputs, and then it's comparing it with a bias and a threshold to determine what the output is. Very, very simple. So who actually uses neural networks? Well, when like 10 years ago, Emmanuel said, Curt, you need to do a lecture on neural networks. And I thought, yeah, I've seen like one paper where somebody used this, but it's not that important. But okay, Emmanuel's the boss, I'll put it together. Nowadays, neural networks are absolutely ubiquitous in everything. So here's an example. You go to China, you don't speak Chinese, you get out your Google, translator, you put in, where's the toilet, dude? And it comes back and says, Qing Wen, Nali Yo Tsuswo. And the guy says, over here, It may not be great literature, but you found the toilet. That's what's important. I'll comment here, Qing Wen. Let Google push this thing and let Google do the talking for you, because Qing Wen means may I ask. Qing Wen means may I kiss you. So big difference. That's my world, folks. One of my great mistakes was Xiang Mao is panda. Xiang Mao is chest hair. So you just gotta get the tones down. But anyway, it works. And you can pick, 50 or 100 different languages here, and away you go. Well, that's all being done by a neural network. Here's an article from a couple years ago about Google's, when you Google show me cat pictures, there's not somebody there picking out pictures of cats. There's a neural network that has been trained to recognize cats. and it pulls out these pictures and shows them to you. And it says here, that when they have here a neural network of 16,000 processors with 1 billion connections between them, and they let it look at YouTube data set where somebody has sat down and said, this is a cat picture, this is a cat, this is a cat, this is a dog, this is a cow, and you'll see how this works in a minute. And the neural network basically then learned how to recognize cats as being something different from dogs. And I saw a picture of this room. It's like, I don't know, it was like maybe 4 or 5 meters long and 3 meters wide and, this high, and it's simply full of servers that are doing these calculations. And the caption thing on this video I was watching said, this room is Google's cat recognizer. It's just astounding. So anyway, there's an example. Here's an example from today's New York Times talking about, they call it intelligent robot surveillance, when it says, advances in artificial intelligence could supercharge surveillance camera, allowing footage to be constantly monitored and instantly analyzed. Now, all over the world, from London to New York to Beijing to everywhere else, there are now surveillance cameras everywhere. In London, they still have a zillion policemen sitting there watching these walls full of cameras and saying, oh, look, there's a robbery going on, send the police. But it's getting to where now the AI stuff is so good at recognizing not just a person, but like, who is this person, that it's getting pretty scary. And here from this article, and of course IBM, Google, Apple, they're all trying to sell this to all the police departments in the world. Here's an image in a store, and the neural network has recognized the people, and you can't read it, but this is labeled person, 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 and this guy is labeled manager. So more than likely, Google has figured the guy's wearing a white shirt and a tie. He's not a real person. He's a manager. So anyway, it's really getting interesting what can be done now with things like facial recognition. Colin.
Scarier is that instead of saying person, it should say Bob, right? Like as soon as they
Yeah.
start to put a name on that person, that's
Yeah.
and they're probably already there.
Yeah. Okay, here's a nicer example. So neural networks are being used quite a bit in medical diagnosis now, where you feed in all your symptoms, and the doctor says, well, I think he's got, a gizzard going bad, and the neural network says, no, I think it's probably the kidney that's failing. One of the nice things is the neural network removes human bias. The downside is it also removes human insight. Here's an example of neural networks in the ocean, based on the Maris instrument, and it says in the paper here, the advantage of neural networks is that they can not only achieve a higher retrieval accuracy than more traditional networks such as band ratio algorithms, but they also allow the inclusion of usually superfluous or unused information such as geometric parameters and atmospheric visibility. So you've got all this information, you feed it to the neural network. You've got RRS at different wavelengths, atmospheric visibility, sun angle, whatever. Let the neural network figure out that the sun angle doesn't affect the chlorophyll. It's the RRSs that affect the chlorophyll. You just feed everything in and get out what you want. Okay, so here's the way it works. You have to first train the neural network. So that's usually called, it says the neural network learns what's going on. Well, really what it's doing is figuring out what weights connect which inputs to which outputs. And that's called training the neural network. And when these things were first cooked up, well, it was kind of like me theory. Okay, it's good on paper, but you can't do anything with it because you can't solve the equations. Well, then somebody invented computers. All of a sudden you can do me calculations. Then they figured out also ways to train neural networks with computers. So what we're going to do, there's a technique I'll show you called backpropagation of errors. So you have known inputs and known outputs. You feed in the inputs along with the correct outputs, and then there's a little algorithm that will keep adjusting the weights till you get better and better results. So we'll run this little Java applet I have here. Okay. Okay, so here's that simplest little neuron network, which is actually called a perceptron in the literature. We've got two inputs, we've got our two weights, we've got the central processor that's going to sum them up, maybe compare with a bias, and then it will output either a 0 or a 1. So if we come down here where we can actually see the calculations. Okay, so we have a training set. We have 4 different sets of data. And there's our first input is either 0 or 1. The second input is 0 or 1. And then the answer we want is if both inputs are 0, we want to get a 0 out. If either input or both are 1, then we want to get a 1 for output. So that's our whole training set. Now, what we're going to do is just start out and make some guess at the weights. And then we're going to take, this input times the weight, get something, this input times the weight, get something. We'll sum those up. We've got a threshold of 0.5. So if the value is less than or equal to 0.5, we'll output a 0. If it's greater than 0.5, we'll output a 1. And then we'll compare the computed answer with the answer that we wanted to get. And then there'll either be no error or there'll be an error. And then what'll happen is you take the error, you have a thing called the training rate. You'll take the error times the training rate and add that to the weight for each input that was not 0. And that'll update the weights. So here's how it goes. So we go down, there's where we start. And so our first input, 0, 0, times the weights, 0, yeah, it's less than a half, output's a 0. There's no error, we've gotten the correct answer. Don't do anything. Now we go do the next iteration. So now we take input set number 2. 0 goes in, 1 goes in. 0 times that's 0, 1 times that is 0.3. The sum is 0.3, it's less than 0.5, output is 0, but the right answer for the second set is 1. Okay, so there's difference of the answer minus the correct minus the answer was 1. So we take the difference, 1 times 0.2 is 0.2, and we add that to this weight, which is 0.3, and you get a new weight of 0.5. This one had 0 input, so he didn't affect anything, so just leave the weight there, okay? So now we have new weights, 0.1 and 0.5. Let's go to the next data set. Okay, we take the third one now, 1 goes in, 0 goes in. That's 0.1, that's 0, sum them 0.1, less than 5, output 0. The right answer for the third set was 1. So once again, we have an error. Multiply times the training rate, add to all the weights that were not 0 inputs, so that's 0.1 plus 0.2 gives a new weight of 0.3. Okay, fine. So now we do another iteration. We take the fourth data set. Ones are going in, 0.3, 1 times 0.5, 0.8. 0.8 is greater than 0.5, output a 1. We wanted to get a 1, no error, don't do anything. Now go back and go through the training set again. So we go back to the next iteration is now going back to inputting our first data set, 1 and 0. So we get 0, 0, sum is 0, no output. We wanted to get a 0, no error, don't do anything. Then we look at the second value. 0 and 1 go in. That's 0 and 0.5. Sum them. Well, if this one is less than the threshold, it doesn't output anything. So there's an error here of 1. So take 0.1 times 0.2 and add to this guy, which now makes the new weights 0.3 and 0.7. Okay, now go to the next value in the training set. Okay, so now we have a 1 and a 0 going in for the third one. It's 0.3, 0. Sum less than 5, output a 0. For the third one, we wanted to get 1. So we take error times training rate, add to all the inputs where there was a non-zero input, and now we have 0.5 and 0.7 as the new weights. Okay, now we look at the next guy here. 4 ones go in times the weights, 1.2 greater than 0.5, it outputs a 1. We wanted a 1, no error, don't do anything. Now go through the training set again. Okay, back to 1, zeros go in, 0 comes out, no error, we're happy. Go to the next one. 0.5, this one gives a 0.7, 0.7 is greater than 0.5, output a 1, we wanted a 1, no error, leave things alone. Do the next one. 0.3, now we have a 0.5 and a 0 here. Well, that's less than or equal to this, so we don't output anything. We have an error. We're going to take 0.2 and add it to this one, and we get now new weights of 0.7 and 0.7. Now, go to the next one. We get, this guy outputs a 1. We wanted a 1 for the fourth one, no error. Go through the training set again. We get zeros, we wanted a 0, no error, we're happy. The next one, we get 0.7, it outputs a 1, we wanted a 1, no error, leave things alone. The third one, we wanted a 1, we got a 1, we're happy. The fourth one, we got 1, we wanted 1, we're happy. We've now reproduced the training set. So I can do more and more iterations, and I never update the weights again because I now have a set of weights that will reproduce the whole training data set perfectly. So I've now let this rather simple little algorithm determine a set of weights that, given whatever input it is, gives me the right answer. And I didn't have to do any thinking about what were the right weights here. So that's what this back propagation of errors thing, how it works. Okay, and then had I picked, a different set of initial weights, I might have gotten a different set of final weights, but they still would have reproduced the data. So I had 0.7 and 0.7, well, I could have had 13 and 13, I'd still be getting the right answer. And I don't care about those details. I only care whether or not I get the right answer. Okay. So, back to here. And the older I get, the more paranoid I become about, things like cleaning my browser of all the little, cookies that have been planted there and all of this. And, I'm sure the National Security Administration knows every bad thing I've said, but anyway, I do my best. Okay, so things to note here. The neural network was able to use the training data to determine a set of weights so that a given input produced the desired output. And after training, then we take those weights and we put in new inputs and get a new output, which we hope is correct, but we don't know, because that wasn't in the training set. And so the knowledge or the memory of the neural networks is contained in the weights. That's very central to the whole idea. Now the catch is, when you have a more complicated situation, you have to balance having enough neurons to capture the physics or biology of what's going on, but you don't want the neural network to start training itself on the noise in your data. So the way that works is, and another way you can view this is to say, well, I've got this big nonlinear model that says input 1 times weight 1 plus input 2 times weight 2 equals output. And there's all these unknown coefficients, which are the weights. And you can view that as just a big nonlinear fitting problem and give it to some fancy fitting algorithm, like there's Levenberg-Marquardt's a nonlinear fitting technique that's commonly used, and let it find the best fit set of weights to connect the input and the output. That's another way to do it. Once again, of course, requires a lot of computer time. Okay, then here's an example now applied to the ocean. So this is from a paper, back in 1995. Wayne Slade, ex-student of Emmanuel's, student of this course, now works at Sequoia. Some of you know him. Anyway, they did an example of applying neural networks to, I think it was, they later did it with CWIF's algorithm, compared it to see how it did. So what they did is they went through these various databases. They pulled out 1,100 sets of data where they had both RRS spectra and chlorophyll values. So then what they did, they constructed a neural network, we'll see in a second, has 5 inputs, which were RRS at 5 wavelengths, had what are called hidden layers, and 1 output, which was the chlorophyll. Then what they did was they took their 1,100 data sets and they randomly partitioned them into 663 points to use for training, 221 for validation, and 221 for testing the final thing. And then they took the final set of weights and applied it to a CWIF's image with one of the algorithms that was used at that time. So here's what their neural network looks like. They have an input layer with 5 inputs. That's the remote sensing reflectance. Then they actually have 2 what are called hidden layers, and each one of these is connected to each of the inputs, and each one of these feeds information to each of the next guys down the road, and then each one of these feeds information to the output, which then sums up those things and decides what the chlorophyll is. So what you do here, it's something of a black art. In this case, they used 2 hidden layers with 6 apiece. Well, where'd they get that? They just kind of like pulled it out of the air. Why not use 1 layer with 12? Well, the reason is by having 2 layers, there's more opportunities for, this guy can now connect to each of these guys. If there was just 1 layer of 12, then these would connect to all of these, and all of these would connect to the output, but you wouldn't have the ability for this neuron to some way, influence each of these. These guys would be down here, and this guy couldn't influence the one down here. So, like I say, it's an area of major research in computer science and so forth to figure out, like, how do you design an optimum geometry of your neural network, and I don't know what the latest is there, but it looks to me like it's, like I say, kind of a black art. And anyway, this is the one they used, and I think I remember asking Wayne, well, how did you decide on 2 layers of 6, why not 2 layers of 5 or 10 or whatever? And the answer is like, well, we just decided to try this and it worked. So that was the state of the art, at least back then. And of course, I didn't show all the connections, but each one of these is connected to all the ones before it and all the ones after it. Okay, so here's the way they train the thing. We've got what's called the training cycle, which we were going through our data set there. And then here's a mean square error between the neural network and the correct output. So you take your training set and you just go through it and you go through it and you go through it. And as you do that and you update the little weights, you keep getting a better and better result. That is, the mean square error keeps getting less and less and less and less the more times you go through the training set. Now, in my little example, we got perfect output, but in the real world you probably won't. But you can at least keep getting better and better. The problem is, as you start here, the neural network is really homing in on what was the most important weights for getting the right chlorophyll. If you keep going long enough, you've kind of captured all the biology, and now you're fitting the noise in that particular data set. Well, you don't want to do that because the real world data set will have different noise, and you don't want to have the noise from the first determining the answer to the second. So that's where they take this validation set. They do a cycle here, they compare, they get the training set. Then they take those weights and they apply them to the individual or the independent validation set, which is not being used to determine the weights. And you say, okay, I apply the weights to the validation set. How well did I do there? Okay, wasn't quite as well. And that will keep decreasing. And then somewhere along the way, when you compare your current weights with the validation set, you start getting worse results. And then you kind of know at this point is where I've kind of finished capturing the biology or the physics. And now this is getting worse because the validation set had different noise than the training set. So here I'm really describing the noise. And so you look at this, you do this process, and when the validation set starts getting worse, you back up and say, this was my optimum set of weights. So I'll stop and use the weights that I found from the training set at this point, and that'll be now my neural network. Then you take those weights and you compare them with the, what do you call them, the testing set or something. Yeah, there's the training, the validation, and the testing set. Okay, so then here's now, they took their training data. When the OC4 thing, they feed all those spectra into it, they get an RMS error of about 0.48. That's on chlorophyll milligrams per cubic meter. And then the neural network, the RMS error was about 0.16. So it's a third of what the OC4 algorithm was giving. Then here's with the validation set. So they've really trained this guy now. Now here's the validation set. Well, the error's about half as big as it was there. And then the testing set, it's basically 0.2 versus 0.5. So a much better RMS error. So here's the actual chlorophyll. Here's the OC4 estimate. There's what you got. Here's the chlorophyll. Here's the neural networks estimate. You just look at that and say, yeah, that's a better retrieval of chlorophylls by, you know, an error of 0.2 versus 0.5 for the RMS error there. Okay, so then they, yeah.
What's the difference between the testing data set and the validation data set?
Okay, so the validation data, the testing and the validation are both independent of the training. They use the validation set to just see when things start getting worse, and then they back up and say, let's use these values. And then they take those values and apply them to the testing set, which is once again still independent. It's just the standard way that people do this. And you usually use a half for training